August 30th, 1944. The Belgian border. It was pitch black. Rain hammered against the canvas roofs of a convoy of United States Army trucks. These vehicles were moving at high speed. It was too fast for the narrow, muddy roads of the European countryside. They were racing west away from the front lines. Their destination was a massive supply depot belonging to the First Army. The drivers were nervous. Their hands gripped the steering wheels tight. They were not worried about German snipers in the trees. They were not scanning the road for landmines. They were looking for the American military police. These men were not on a routine supply run. They were executing a heist. The evidence of the crime was everywhere. The soldiers had ripped the shoulder patches from their uniforms. They had used buckets of olive drab paint to cover the Third Army symbols on the truck doors. In their pockets, they carried forged transport papers. These orders came from the very top. They came from General George S. Patton himself. The mission was direct. They had to drive into the First Army depot and park among the local units. They would pretend to be First Army drivers. Their goal was to load 500,000 gallons of gasoline into their tankers and drive away. It was a massive theft of resources. What were the risks? The consequences were absolute. If the military police caught them, the drivers faced an immediate court-martial. In wartime, stealing supplies from your own side is a felony. But Patton did not view this as a crime. To him, it was a matter of survival. The situation at the front was critical. The footage from the time shows rows of silent Shermans. Patton's tanks were sitting dead on the road to Germany. The engines were dry. There was no sound of combustion. Supreme Headquarters had cut the Third Army off from the supply chain. General Eisenhower had diverted every August 1944. This is the timeline of a massive fuel heist. General George S. Patton became a thief to win a war. He deceived his superiors. He ignored direct orders. Even Dwight D. Eisenhower was left searching for missing supplies that had vanished into the tanks of the Third Army. Why did Patton turn to crime? It was a matter of momentum. The breakout from Normandy changed the pace of the conflict. After months of slow, brutal fighting in the hedgerows, the Allied forces finally broke through the German lines. Leading the charge was Patton's Third Army. They moved faster than any military force in history, 20 miles a day, 40 miles a day, sometimes 60 miles in a single 24-hour period. In the frame, American tanks racing through French villages, dust clouds rising behind convoys. The Third Army liberated Paris. They crossed the Seine River. They were driving the German forces back toward the Reich. But speed creates a logistical nightmare. A modern army is a machine that consumes gasoline. It does not stop eating. How much did they need? The math was simple but devastating. One Sherman tank travels exactly 1 mile on 1 gallon of fuel. Patton commanded thousands of tanks. He had thousands of supply trucks and thousands of jeeps. Every single day, the Third Army required 350,000 gallons of fuel just to remain in motion. If they engaged in combat, that number jumped to 450,000 gallons. The supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Fuel originated on the beaches of Normandy, hundreds of miles behind the front lines. To bridge the gap, the military created the Red Ball Express. This was August 29, 1944. A crisis meeting began at Supreme Headquarters. General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a logistical nightmare. He had two generals competing for glory. Patton pushed from the south. Montgomery advanced from the north. Eisenhower had enough supplies for only one of them. The logistics system was breaking down. Ports were too far away. Trucks were failing. There was not enough gasoline to keep both massive armies moving at full speed. Field Marshal Montgomery demanded everything. He proposed Operation Market Garden. This was a plan for a massive strike through Belgium and Holland. Montgomery made a bold promise. He told Eisenhower he could end the war with one powerful thrust to Berlin. But there was a price. Montgomery demanded that Patton be stopped. He wanted every drop of fuel diverted to the British lines. Eisenhower wanted to keep the alliance from fracturing. He made his choice. He issued a formal order. Priority for all supplies shifted to the 21st Army Group in the north. This meant Montgomery received everything. For Patton, the news was a tactical disaster. He was at his headquarters near the city of Verdun when the message arrived from high command. The text was clear. Third Army will halt. You will receive no fuel until further notice. The camera records the scene. Patton exploded. He stood over a table covered in tactical maps. He smashed his fist onto the paper. He shouted that it was a terrible mistake. He saw the reality on the ground. The Germans were retreating. Their lines were broken. Patton believed that stopping now gave the enemy a lifeline. He argued that the Allies were buying the Germans time to regroup. He turned to General Omar Bradley. Patton demanded 400,000 gallons of gasoline. He claimed he could reach Germany in 2 days. He promised to end the war. But Bradley remained still. He had no power to change the order. He told Patton that Eisenhower had made his final decision. The fuel belonged to Montgomery. The advance in the South, August 31st, 1944. The Third Army ran out of fuel. It was a mechanical cardiac arrest. Along the road to the Moselle River, miles of American Sherman tanks sat motionless in the dirt. Drivers sat on the steel hulls, smoking cigarettes and staring toward the eastern horizon. The German army was retreating just a few miles away. The Americans had the guns and the men, but the engines were dead. General George S. Patton toured the stalled lines in his Jeep. He saw his massive armored machine brought to a total standstill. It wasn't the German 88mm guns that stopped him. It was a lack of signatures on supply forms. In the distance, through binoculars, he saw German columns escaping into the tree line. He watched them digging trenches and hauling artillery onto the high ground on the far side of the river. How much did this delay cost? At first glance, a simple logistics error, but in reality, a death sentence for thousands. Patton knew that every hour his tanks sat idle, the Germans grew stronger. Every minute of silence meant more landmines and more concrete bunkers. The price of victory was rising in blood. The footage from the era shows the scene, rows of silent olive-drab vehicles stretching to the horizon. Patton returned to his tent and opened his diary. He wrote a single, jagged sentence. To sit here and wait is murder. He refused to follow the schedule. Patton summoned his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay. He called in his senior supply officers. The room was tense. The sound of boots on wooden floorboards was the only noise. Patton did not ask for a briefing or a PowerPoint slide. He did not ask for a plan. He gave a direct verbal order. Get me gas. The general leaned forward. He told them he did not care how they found the fuel. He did not care who they had to rob or what warehouses they had to raid. He told them to take it from other units or hijack the supply trucks meant for other armies. Just get it. The officers looked at each other in silence. No one spoke. No one asked for clarification. They understood the command perfectly. They weren't going to wait for the official Red Ball Express shipments. They were going to become thieves in uniform. The scavenge began immediately. 500,000 gallons. That was the target. General George S. Patton needed fuel to keep his tanks moving, and he did not care where it came from. His intelligence officers identified a massive supply depot sitting in the rear of the U.S. First Army sector. General Courtney Hodges and the First Army were stationary under orders to slow down. They had a surplus. Thousands of green jerry cans sat in neat rows, filled and waiting. Patton moved fast. He organized a provisional truck company. He did not look for logistics experts. He handpicked his toughest drivers and officers with a talent for deception. The instructions were specific. Every soldier stripped the Third Army insignias from their uniforms. They ripped off shoulder patches. They grabbed cans of olive drab paint and covered the bumper codes on every vehicle. The paperwork was the final step. The team forged requisition forms and created high-priority documents. The papers claimed the fuel was for a Priority 1 mission authorized by Chef. This was a crime under military law. It was also Patton's only way forward. Rain fell as the convoy moved out under total darkness. They drove north toward the First Army lines. At the military police checkpoints, the drivers didn't blink. The MPS signaled them to stop. When questioned, the officers told a pre-rehearsed lie. They claimed to be First Army supply units moving stock to a forward dump. The MPS waved them through. They reached the depot. Security was light. The quartermaster on duty looked at the forged papers. The documents looked official, and the officers spoke with total confidence. The quartermaster signaled his men. "Load them up," he said. The work began immediately. For 4 hours, Patton's men hoisted steel cans onto the truck beds. They moved 500,000 gallons of gasoline. This was enough fuel to power an entire armored division for 7 days of combat. But they didn't stop with the gas. They grabbed boxes of rations. They seized stacks of maps. They even loaded spare tank tracks onto the trailers. At first glance, it was a routine transfer. In reality, it was a massive heist against their own allies. As the September 1944. General Omar Bradley arrived at George Patton's headquarters. He carried a direct command from the high leadership. The mission was simple: stop the tanks. Bradley looked at Patton and delivered the halt order. He stated that the Third Army had no fuel left in its reserves. Patton listened. He kept his expression neutral and his voice calm. He did not mention the 500,000 gallons of gasoline his men had just hijacked from the communication zone. He did not describe the columns of trucks currently pumping stolen fuel into his Sherman tanks. Patton reached for a map. He told Bradley that his units were merely conducting light reconnaissance. This was a tactical deception. Patton knew a request for an offensive would be denied immediately. However, he also knew that an ongoing battle is harder to stop than a plan on paper. He waited for the clock to run out. A radio operator entered the room with a fresh report. Patton's lead elements were already engaging German positions near the Moselle River. This was not a scout mission. It was a full-scale assault. Bradley focused on Patton. He asked how the tanks were moving without a single drop of official fuel. Patton shrugged his shoulders. He claimed his men had found local supplies and optimized their consumption. It was a blatant lie. Bradley saw the reality on the sit map. He knew Patton had raided every fuel depot in France to keep his engines turning. But Bradley prioritized the breakthrough over the regulations. He looked at the terrain and gave a verbal warning. He told Patton that if the Third Army got stuck, there would be no rescue and no extra supplies. Patton nodded. The deal was made in silence. The Third Army lunged forward. Stolen gasoline burned in the engines as the armored divisions hit the Moselle River. The impact was violent. German intelligence had reported that the Americans were immobilized by logistics. They expected weeks of preparation time to build their river defenses. Instead, American steel was at their throat. The footage from the front shows the chaos. Soldiers crossed the water under heavy fire. The fighting was brutal and the casualties mounted. But the speed of the attack gave the Germans no time to regroup. Because Patton refused to wait for permission, the bridgeheads held. His divisions seized the city of Nancy. They bypassed and surrounded the fortress at Metz. Those 500,000 gallons of stolen fuel changed the map of Europe. The gamble had paid off. August 1944. At Supreme Headquarters, the ledger did not balance. The quartermaster of the First Army began an audit of his depots. He discovered a massive deficit in his inventory. Reports arrived detailing sightings of unmarked trucks on the back roads. These ghost convoys carried no official insignias. The math was impossible. 500,000 gallons of gasoline do not simply vanish into thin air. The investigation led to one man. It led to George S. Patton. Historians still dissect the logistics of 1944. Many experts reach the same conclusion. Eisenhower's decision to prioritize Montgomery was his greatest strategic failure. Montgomery launched Operation Market Garden. It was a tactical disaster. Paratroopers were dropped too far from their objectives. The operation stalled at the bridge in Arnhem. It was a bridge too far. Could the war have ended sooner? The logic is simple. If those 500,000 gallons had reached the Third Army, Patton would not have stopped. His tanks would have pierced the Siegfried Line months before winter. Instead, Patton was forced to scavenge. He operated on scraps. He resorted to organized theft. Even under these constraints, his territorial gains exceeded those of any other Allied commander. In the archives, one photograph captures the moment. The frame shows Patton standing beside a Sherman tank. His jacket is covered in grit. His face shows deep exhaustion. But the camera records something else, a sharp, focused intensity in his gaze. He did not care about his military pension. He did not seek a higher rank or a seat at the peace table. Patton had one objective. He wanted to win. If winning required him to become a criminal, he would be the most efficient thief in the European theater. He ignored the chain of command. He violated military law. He stole from his own allies to kill his enemies. At first glance,